The morning Harold Vance died, the only person in the room with him was the woman the family had spent 3 years pretending not to see. Her name was Tasha Boyd. She was 34 years old, and for 940 days she had risen at 5 in the morning to bathe a man who was not her father, who was not her blood, who could not, by the end, remember her name on the bad days. She had given up a job that paid $41,000 a year to do it. She had given up the small apartment with the good light. She had given up a man named Andre who wanted to marry her and could not wait through a sacrifice he did not understand. She had given up almost everything a person can give up that is not a life. And on the morning Harold's heart finally stopped, his 3 grown children were each more than an hour away, asleep in beds they did not have to make themselves, and the last hand he held was hers. She did not know yet that the holding of that hand would change every single thing about the years she had left. She only knew that she was tired and that the man she had cared for was gone, and that the house had gone very quiet in the way houses do when the one thing keeping them alive stops. Stay with me, because this is a story about what gets counted when nobody thinks anyone is counting. 3 years before that morning, Tasha had been a home health aide for an agency that placed her in a different house every few months. She was good at it. She was the one the office sent to the hard cases, the families nobody else could handle, the patients who threw their pills and cursed the help and grieved their own bodies out loud. She did not take it personally. She had buried her own mother at 26, alone, after watching her shrink in a county bed while the insurance argued, and somewhere in those long nights she had decided that nobody under her care would die feeling like a burden. It was not a slogan to her, it was the only religion she had left. The agency sent her to the Vance house on a grey Tuesday in October. She remembered the grey because the river that ran behind the property was the same colour as the sky, and the big windows of the house had been built to frame that river, and the whole place looked like a photograph of money that had stopped being happy a long time ago. Harold Vance was 78 then. He had built a regional chain of hardware stores from a single shop his own father had left him, and he had sold that chain at the right moment to a national company for a sum that nobody in the family ever said out loud in front of strangers. He had a stroke that spring that took the strength from his right side and a good deal of his speech, and a second small one in August that took more. His wife had been gone 11 years. His 3 children had careers and homes in 3 different cities, and what they had arranged for their father, after a great deal of discussion about cost, was a rotation of agency aides and a part-time nurse and a house manager who came twice a week to pay the bills. Tasha was supposed to be there 4 months. She stayed 3 years. She did not plan to. The first month, she did her job and went home, the way she always did, careful not to grow attached, because attachment was the thing that hollowed out everyone she had ever worked beside. Hal Vance, though, was not an easy man to keep at a distance. He was furious in the beginning, furious at his ruined mouth and his dead hand, and the indignity of a stranger lifting him onto a toilet. He threw a cup of water at her on the 3rd day. She wiped it up without a word and brought him a fresh cup and set it where his good hand could reach, and she said, not unkindly, that she had been hit by better aimers than him, and something in his ruined face moved that might have been the ghost of a laugh. After that he let her in, by inches. She learned that he had been a man who fixed things, that his hands before the stroke had known the inside of every kind of lock and hinge and small motor a person could carry into a hardware store with a problem, that he hated the television and loved the radio, the AM stations with the old voices, that he could no longer read but would hold a book in his good hand for an hour as if the weight of it was a kind of company. She started reading to him in the afternoons after his lunch, when the agency hours technically ended and she technically should have gone home. She read him whatever was on his shelves, westerns mostly, A History of the Erie Canal, a water-stained paperback about a man who sailed alone around the world. The children noticed the extra hours only because they showed up on no invoice. Harold's oldest, a lawyer named Gregory who lived 2 states away and managed the family's affairs by phone, called the agency to confirm that nobody was billing for time that had not been authorized. Nobody was. Tasha was reading to a dying man on her own clock for free, and the family's first response was to make sure it would not cost them anything. You may already feel the shape of this. Hold on to it. The world keeps a ledger even when the people in it refuse to. By the end of the first year, Harold's decline had outpaced what the agency rotation could carry, and there was a meeting, the kind of meeting families have, in kitchens with calculators open. Round-the-clock memory care, the good kind, ran past $9,000 a month. The children did the arithmetic out loud. Gregory, the lawyer. Denise, the middle one, who ran a dental practice and spoke about her father, in the past tense already. And Marcus, the youngest, who said the least and looked at the floor the most. They were not cruel people, exactly. They were people who had learned to convert their father into a line item because the alternative was to feel the whole weight of him at once, and nobody had taught them how to carry that. It was Tasha who offered the thing none of them wanted to say. She would do it. She would leave the agency, move into the house, and care for Harold full-time. For a flat monthly wage that was less than half what a facility would cost. She did not offer it to save them money. She offered it because she had sat in that kitchen and watched 3 grown children negotiate the price of their own father's last years, and she could not stand the thought of him being shipped somewhere to be tended by people on the clock who did not know he loved the AM radio. Gregory had a contract drawn up. Of course he did. It arrived by courier in a stiff envelope, 11 pages, and it specified her wage, her duties, her hours, which were technically all of them. It specified that she was an employee and not a member of the family and not a tenant with any right to remain, and that her position ended the day Harold no longer required care, by which everyone understood the day he died. There was a clause about confidentiality. There was a clause about gifts, that she was not to accept any item of value from the patient, a clause Gregory would later wish, with everything in him, that he had thought to make broader. She read every line at the kitchen table, with a glass of water sweating beside her, and the old man asleep down the hall. She understood exactly what she was signing. She signed it. $3,200 a month to give a man a death with dignity in it. She did the math on her own life later. Alone, in the room they gave her at the back of the house, with a pencil on the back of an envelope, the years and the wage and the man, named Andre, who would not wait and understood that she was trading her 30s for it, and she sat with that for a long time in the dark and signed anyway, in her heart, the part of the contract that was not on any page. That was the bargain. Remember the number. Remember that she read every line and signed it with her eyes open. The second year was the hard one. Harold lost the thread of time. He woke believing his wife was in the next room, and Tasha had to decide, fresh each morning, whether the kindness was to tell him the truth or to let him have one more hour of her being alive. He stopped being able to feed himself. He had a stretch in the winter where he did not know Tasha at all and called her by his sister's name, a sister who had died in 1971, and Tasha answered to it because being a dead sister who could comfort him was better than being a stranger who frightened him. She did the laundry and the cooking and the medications laid out in the little plastic grid. She learned to read the weather of his moods the way sailors read a sky. She held his head when he was sick and changed the sheets at 3 in the morning and sang to him low the few hymns she remembered from her mother's church, and on the nights that were very bad, she slept in the chair beside his bed with her hand on his chest so she would wake if his breathing changed. The children visited less as the visits grew harder. Denise came at Christmas and cried in the car before she came in and left after 90 minutes. And Tasha had watched her from the window, sitting out there in the cold with her hands on the wheel, gathering herself, and had felt sorry for her, because grief that cannot find a door to come through is its own kind of suffering. Inside, Denise had stood at the foot of her father's bed in a good coat and called him Daddy in a small voice, and he had looked at her with the polite confusion of a man greeting a stranger, and Denise had not been able to bear it for more than an hour and a half. Marcus came twice that year. He sat in the corner the way a boy sits in a principal's office, and once, near the door, on his way out, he asked Tasha quietly whether his father was in pain. She told him the truth, gently, the way she had learned to tell families the truth. That there was discomfort but not pain, that they kept ahead of it, that he was comfortable. Marcus put his hand over his mouth and stood like that for a moment just inside the doorway, a grown man holding back the whole ocean with one hand, and then he nodded and said thank you and left before it could spill. Gregory did not come at all in the second year. He called. He always called. He called to confirm the medication costs and to ask whether the property taxes had been paid, and once, in a careful lawyer's voice, to ask whether his father had said anything about the will. And Tasha had stood in the kitchen with the phone against her ear and looked through the doorway at the old man asleep in his chair with the radio low and had answered evenly that Mr. Breeder. Vance did not talk about money, and it had been the truth. Tasha said, Harold did not talk about money. It was the truth. The only things Harold talked about in the broken sentences he had left were the river and the radio and a dog he had owned as a boy named Sailor. And on his clearest days his hands, which he would hold up in front of his face and study as though trying to remember what they used to be able to do. There is a kind of work the world has decided is worth almost nothing, and it is almost always done by women, and it is almost always done in rooms nobody important ever enters. Tasha did that work for 3 years. I want you to hold the weight of it before we go on, because the people in this story were about to be reminded of it in a way none of them saw coming. The third year, Harold came back to himself in pieces. It happens that way sometimes, near the end, a strange clearing of the fog, a few weeks where the person you lost returns to say the things they need to say. He knew Tasha's name again. He caught her by it and held her hand, and one afternoon, with the river grey in the window and the radio low, he said something to her that she did not understand at the time and would understand completely 6 weeks later. He said thank you for staying when staying. Paid nothing. She told him it paid plenty. He shook his head, slow, the way he did everything now, and he said, you will see. She thought it was the talk of a tired old man. She squeezed his hand and read him another chapter and did not think about it again until a lawyer, who was not Gregory, said the same words back to her in a room full of people who had come to collect. 2 weeks before he died, Harold asked her to bring him a particular box. It was a small wooden thing, dovetailed at the corners, the kind of joinery a man who loved hinges and locks would have made himself, and it had sat on the high shelf in his closet the entire 3 years she had been there. She brought it down and set it in his lap. He could not open it. His good hand was not good enough anymore. So she opened it for him at his nod, and inside there were a few old photographs, a watch that no longer ran, a child's brass dog tag with the name Sailor stamped into it, and an envelope sealed, with nothing written on the front. He put his hand on the envelope and looked at her for a long time. He did not ask her to open it. He just wanted, she thought, to know it was still there. She closed the box and put it back where it lived, and that was the last clear afternoon they had. So, he died on a Thursday in the first week of spring just after dawn, with his hand in hers and the radio playing low and the river outside the window finally blue. She called the children, she called the doctor. She did the last things, the things she had done for strangers 100 times, and never once for someone she had come to love, and she found that knowing how did not make it easier. The funeral home came. Gregory arrived that afternoon, then Denise, then Marcus, and the house that had been so quiet for 3 years, filled up with the brisk energy of people who have things to settle. That was when Tasha first felt herself become invisible again. It was small things at first. Gregory thanked her for her service, in the voice he probably used for retiring employees. Denise asked, not unkindly but not warmly either, how soon Tasha thought she could have her things out of the back room, since the house would need to be readied for sale. Nobody asked her how she was. Nobody asked what the last morning had been like, whether their father had been afraid, what his last clear words had been. She had 3 years of him inside her, every mood and fear and small returning joy, and not one of them asked her to share a single piece of it. They had inherited a man they had outsourced, and now they had come to inventory what was left. The funeral was on a Saturday. Tasha sat in the back. She had pressed the navy dress the night before on the ironing board in the back room, and she had practiced, the way you practice a thing you are afraid you will not be able to do, the act of getting through an hour without falling apart in front of people who would find her grief presumptuous. A handful of old business associates came. Men in good coats who shook the children's hands and called Harold a builder and a straight dealer, and did not, any of them, know that he had loved the AM radio, or that he had owned a dog named Sailor, or that near the end he had wanted only to know the small things were still where he had left them. A few neighbours came. The children sat in the front row and accepted condolences with the composure of people who had done their grieving in installments over 3 years, a little at Christmas, a little on the rare visits, the grief paid down in manageable sums so that none of it would ever come due all at once. Denise wore sunglasses indoors. Gregory shook every hand and thanked every mourner and looked, Tasha thought, like a man chairing a meeting. Tasha cried more than any of them, quietly, in the back, with her hands folded in her lap and the tears running without sound, because she was the only one in the building who had been in the room. Afterward, when the pews emptied, Marcus found her by the door. He held her hand for a second. "He liked you," he said, and the word "liked" cracked in the middle, broke clean in half, and for a moment the careful management of the whole family fell off his face, and there was only a son who had lost his father and did not know what to do with his hands. Then Denise called his name from across the room, and the management came back down over him like a shade, and he went. The reading of the will was set for the following Tuesday, at the office of a firm in the city, and Tasha was not told about it. She found out because the house manager mentioned it in passing, assuming she knew, and then looked embarrassed when she realized Tasha did not. Tasha would not have gone at all. It was not her business, she thought. She was the help, and the help did not attend the reading of the will. Then on Monday evening her phone rang, and a voice she did not know, a woman, professional and kind, introduced herself as calling from the office of Eleanor Cho, attorney, and said that Mr. Boyd's presence was requested at the reading of the last will and testament of Harold Vance, 11 o'clock the next morning, and that it was important that she attend. Tasha asked if there had been a mistake. The woman said there had not. She almost did not go. She lay awake most of the night, certain it was some clerical formality, that she would arrive and sit in a hallway and sign something releasing her final wages and be sent home with a handshake. She got up at 5 anyway, out of habit, and stood in the kitchen of the silent house and made coffee she did not drink, because for 3 years 5 in the morning had meant Harold needed her, and her body did not yet know how to believe that it no longer did. She wore the one good dress she owned, the navy one, funeral dress, and she pinned her hair the way her mother had taught her for church. And she looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a moment and saw a tired woman of 34 in a borrowed kind of formality, and could not imagine why a lawyer would want her in the room. She took 2 buses. The first was nearly empty at that hour, the second crowded with people going to jobs, and she stood the whole way with her purse held in both hands against her chest. She walked the last 6 blocks because the office was in a part of the city where parking cost more than she had, past glass towers and coffee shops where a sandwich cost what she used to budget for a day, and she arrived 10 minutes early and sat in a waiting room with marble floors that reminded her of the Vance house. Money that had stopped being happy a long time ago. The children were already there. Gregory looked at her with open confusion when she walked in. Denise frowned. Only Marcus gave her a small nod. Gregory crossed the room and asked her, low, whether someone had told her she needed to be here, and when she said the lawyer's office had called, he pressed his mouth into a line and said there must be some confusion about the final paperwork, that her wages would be settled separately, that she did not need to sit through the family's private business. He was not cruel about it. He was managing, the way he managed everything, moving the help out of the room before the real matter began. That was when the door opened and Eleanor Cho came out. She was a small woman in her 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of stillness that makes a room organize itself around her. She greeted the children by name. Then she looked past them to the woman in the navy dress, sitting against the wall, and her whole face changed, softened, and she crossed the marble floor and put out her hand and said, "You must be Tasha. He spoke about you." "I am very glad you came," Gregory said, his sister's name under his breath. Denise said nothing. Marcus looked at Tasha as though seeing her for the first time. They went into a conference room with a long table and a window that looked out over the river, the same river threading silver through the city before it widened out past the Vance house miles downstream. Eleanor Cho sat at the head. The 3 children sat along one side, Tasha uncertain, took a chair near the door half out of the circle, the place she had learned to take. Eleanor Cho looked at her and said quietly, "Please, sit closer. This concerns you." She opened a folder. She explained, in the plain way of someone who has done this many times, that Harold Vance had executed a new will 26 months earlier, that he had been examined by 2 physicians on the day of signing to attest to his capacity, that the document was sound and witnessed and beyond challenge. Gregory's posture changed at the words, "new will." He was a lawyer. He understood before anyone what those words could mean. 26 months earlier, Tasha did the arithmetic without meaning to. 26 months earlier was the 2nd year, the hard year, the year she had answered to a dead sister's name and slept in the chair with her hand on his chest. Eleanor Cho began to read. There were the expected things first. Bequests to a hospital, to the historical society that maintained the Canal Museum he had loved, to a scholarship at the trade school where he had learned his father's business, a specific gift to each grandchild held in trust. The house by the river, and its contents and the proceeds of its sale. Divided among the 3 children in equal thirds along with the bulk of the investment accounts. Gregory's shoulders eased a fraction with each line. This was the will of a sensible man. This was the document he had expected, give or take. Then Eleanor Cho turned a page, and her voice changed, not in volume but in care. The way a person's voice changes when they have arrived at the part that matters most to the one who wrote it. She said that the remainder of the estate, a separate account that Harold Vance had set aside and grown deliberately over the final years of his life, untouched by the division of the house and the investments, was left in its entirety to Tasha Boyd. She read the figure. It was not a tip. It was not a bonus for services rendered. It was the kind of number that ends one life and begins another. And when Eleanor Cho said it out loud, the room went so silent that Tasha could hear the river, or thought she could, through the glass. She did not understand at first that the name being read was hers. She had spent 3 years learning to sit at the edge of rooms like this one, and her mind refused the information the way a hand refuses a flame. Then Eleanor Cho looked up from the page, directly at her, and read the words Harold had dictated himself, the words he had said to her in the grey afternoon with the radio low. She read, "To Tasha Boyd, who stayed when staying paid nothing, who gave my last years a dignity my own money could not buy, who treated me as a man and not a debt, I leave this, with my thanks and my apology that the world counts such work for so little. You will see now what I meant." Tasha put her hand over her mouth. It was the same gesture Marcus had made by the door, a year before, when he learned his father was in pain. Grief and recognition used the same hands. Gregory was on his feet, not shouting, never that. He was too careful a man to shout in a lawyer's office, but standing, his voice tight and fast, the voice of someone whose arithmetic has just been overturned. He said the words undue influence. He said the words isolated and vulnerable. He said that a paid caregiver who controlled access to a sick old man who was alone with him for 3 years, who read to him and slept beside him and answered to whatever name he gave her, was precisely the kind of person the law was built to be suspicious of. He said he would contest it. He said it with the certainty of a man who had never in his life lost an argument he could afford to win. Eleanor Cho let him finish. Then she opened a second folder. She had been Harold's attorney for 30 years, she said. She had drawn his first will and his second, and this his third and last. And because Harold had known exactly the conversation that would happen in this room on this day, he had spent the last years of his life making certain it could not succeed. She slid documents across the table. The physician's attestations of capacity signed the day of the new will. A video, she said, recorded that same day, in which Harold Vance, clear-eyed in one of his good stretches, explained in his own broken but unmistakable voice why he was doing what he was doing, and named each of his children and said that he loved them, and said also that they had sent strangers to tend him, and a stranger had become the only family in the room, and that a man got to decide who had earned his thanks. And then there were the other papers, letters Harold had dictated to Eleanor Cho across 2 years, kept in the file, a log. Not a sentimental thing, but a record, the kind a man who loved hinges and locks would keep. Dates. The Christmas Denise stayed 90 minutes. The 2 visits Marcus managed. The year Gregory did not come at all. Beside each date in Eleanor Cho's transcription of Harold's words, a plain accounting of who had been in the room and who had not, when the nights were bad, when the sister's name was the only one that comforted him, who had been there to answer to it. The world keeps a ledger even when the people in it refuse to. Harold Vance had simply written his down. Gregory sat back into his chair. The fight went out of him the way air goes out of a thing that has been holding its shape only by pressure. He was a lawyer. He understood that there was nothing here to contest, that his father had built a wall around this gift, brick by brick, over 2 years, anticipating his own son's every objection, and that the wall would hold. It was not the legal certainty that finally silenced him, though. It was the log. It was seeing the second year written out in dates, the year he had managed his father by phone and confirmed the medication costs, and asked in his careful voice whether the old man had said anything about the will. He had been auditing his inheritance while a stranger held his father through the worst nights of his life, and now the audit had been turned around and read back to him, and there was no line in it he could dispute. Denise had begun, quietly, to cry. Not the composed grief of the funeral. Something underneath it, older, worse. The grief of a person realizing what they traded and what it cost, and that the bill had come due in front of witnesses. She did not say anything. She did not look at Tasha. She looked at the table, and her shoulders moved. And for the first time in 3 years, she let herself feel the whole weight of her father at once. It was Marcus who spoke, the youngest, who had said the least and looked to the floor, the most. He stood and he came around the table. And Tasha braced for whatever a wounded family does next. He only stopped in front of her and his face was wet, and he said, "Was he afraid at the end? 3 days I have wanted to ask, and I could not. Was my father afraid?" And Tasha, who had been waiting 3 years for one of them to ask her a single thing about the man instead of his money, told him. She told him about the last morning, the radio low, the river turning blue, the way Harold's breathing had eased at the end as though he were finally setting down something heavy. She told him his father had not been afraid. She told him about Sailor, the dog, and the box with the brass tag and the photographs, and how near the end Harold had wanted only to know that the small things were still where he had left them. She gave Marcus his father back, the part of him no money could divide, and Marcus listened with his hand pressed over his mouth. And when she finished, he said, "Thank you," in a voice that had nothing of the family's careful management left in it, only a son. Eleanor Cho let the room be quiet for a while. Then she said there was one more thing. Harold had left a specific instruction, not a bequest, a request. And she looked at Tasha when she said it. He had asked that the small wooden box from the high shelf in his closet, the one with the photographs and the watch and the brass tag, be given to Tasha with its contents, and that the sealed envelope inside it was for her alone, to be opened in private when she was ready. Tasha had forgotten the box. She had forgotten the envelope with nothing written on the front, the one Harold had put his hand on and looked at for so long without asking her to open. She understood now that he had been showing it to her, that the last clear afternoon they had spent together, he had been pointing the way to a thing he could not bring himself to say out loud, and she had closed the box and put it back. And he had let her because he had known the lawyer would do the rest. She did not open the envelope in the office. She took the box home to the back room she had been asked to empty, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed where she had slept for 3 years, and she opened it there alone, the way he had asked. Inside was a single sheet of paper and Harold's handwriting from before the strokes, shaky but his, because Eleanor Cho told her later that he had written it himself, by hand, 2 years before he died. On one of the mornings his hand still worked, refusing to let anyone transcribe it. It was not about money. The money was the lawyer's business. This was his. It said that when his wife was dying 11 years before, he had hired help, and the help had been kind, and he had not noticed at the time how much that kindness was worth because he had been drowning in his own grief. It said that he had spent his whole life fixing things, locks and hinges and small motors, and that he had been a good father in the ways that could be measured, and a poor one in the ways that could not. and that he had not understood the difference until he was the broken thing on the table and a stranger had sat down to fix him without being asked. It said, "You did not come to me as family, but you became it." And a man gets to decide, at the end, who his family was. It said, "Do something good with what I left you, and do not let anyone make you feel you did not earn it, because I kept count, and you earned every cent and a great deal more I could not put a number on." And it was signed, not Mr. Bader. Vance, not Harold Vance, but Harold, the way she had never once been allowed to call him while he lived, his last small gift, the dropping of the wool between them. She sat with it for a long time. In the room they had asked her to empty, and she wept, and the weeping was not only grief. It was the particular and overwhelming relief of being seen, of having done a thing in the dark for 3 years that the whole world had agreed was worth almost nothing, and learning that one person had been keeping count the entire time. Have you ever done a thing like that, the quiet, faithful thing, in a room nobody important ever entered, and wondered whether anyone would ever know? Hold that question. I will leave it with you. She did not spend the money the way people imagine money like. That gets spent. She paid off the debt from her mother's last illness, the debt she had been carrying for 8 years, the county hospital bill the insurance had argued over while her mother shrank in the bed. She paid it in a single morning and sat in her car afterward and shook. Then she did the thing that surprised everyone who heard about it later, the thing that made even Gregory, much later, go quiet when it was mentioned. She used the rest to build something. There is a kind of work the world has decided is worth almost nothing, done in rooms nobody important ever enters, almost always by women, almost always for the dying. Tasha had done that work for 3 years for a flat wage of $3,200 a month, and she knew the others who did it, the aides the agency sent to the hard cases, the women who held strangers through the worst nights of their lives and went home on 2 buses and were asked how soon they could empty the back room. She started a fund for them, not a charity that put a wealthy name on a building. A plain working fund that paid for an aide to stay an extra hour off the clock, that covered the bus fare, and the childcare and the small dignities that the line items never did, that made it possible for the people who did the uncounted work to do a little more of it without being broken by the cost. She named it after a dog. The Sailor Fund. Nobody but her and a dead man knew why, and that was exactly how she wanted it. She kept the box on a shelf where she could see it, the photographs and the watch that did not run, and the brass tag with Sailor stamped into it. She never put the letter in a frame. It lived in the box the way Harold's life had lived in the box, the small things kept where a person could reach them. A year after the reading of the will, on the anniversary of the Grey Tuesday, she had first walked into the Vance house, Marcus called her. Not Gregory, not Denise, though both of them, in their own slow ways, had come around to something like peace with her. Denise sending a card at Christmas, Gregory, once, stiffly, asking if the fund needed legal help, and providing it for free when she said it did. It was Marcus in the end who called on the anniversary, every year after, the youngest, who had asked the only question that mattered in that conference room. He called to ask her how she was. Just that, how are you, Tasha? The question none of them had asked in the days after his father died, asked now, freely, by the one who had learned from a stranger what his father had been trying to teach the whole family for 3 years from a sickbed they kept leaving. She told him she was well. She told him about the fund, the aide it had let stay an extra hour, the woman it had let go home with bus fare in her pocket and her dignity intact. She told him she still kept the radio on the AM stations in the afternoons. The old voices, because she had gotten used to them, because the house was too quiet without them. And every year when she said that, Marcus laughed the small laugh of a man remembering his father, and the laugh was a kind of grief and a kind of gift at once, the two things grown finally inseparable. The river still ran behind the house where it all happened, though strangers lived there now. Tasha drove out to see it once, the spring after the will was read, and stood on the public bank a little ways downstream, and watched the water that had been grey on the day she arrived and blue on the day he died. She thought about the ledger, the one the world refuses to keep, and a man who loved, Hinges, had kept anyway, in his own hand, brick by brick, for 2 years. so that no one could ever make the woman who held him feel she had not earned her place in the room. She thought kindness has a longer memory than the people who give it can imagine. Then she got back in her car and she drove home and she put the radio on low, the old voices, the river of them, and she let the house fill up with the sound. She had given up a job that paid $41,000 a year. She had given up the apartment with the good light and a man who could not wait, and her 30s, and almost everything a person can give up that is not a life. And in a conference room with a window over the river, a small, silver-haired woman had read out loud the one thing Tasha had never once been given in all the years of her quiet, faithful work, the thing she had stopped believing the world handed out at all. She had been counted. She had been seen. And the seeing, it turned out, had been happening the whole time, in the dark, by the one person in the room, kept in a wooden box on a high shelf, waiting for a morning when a lawyer would open the lid and let the light in. If this story moved you, sit a moment with the person in your own life who did the uncounted work, the one in the room nobody entered, and let them know that you saw. And if you want another story of a faithful soul finally given their due, I have one waiting for you, about a janitor who swept the same floors for 20 years and what the company found when they finally looked up.